Hi, welcome to Mr. Otter Studio. Today I'm going to show you how to paint a tree using watercolor. We will draw it together and then I'm going to show you two different ways to paint it in. One where we blot out the highlights using our paper towel. And the second method is where we use lighter colors or brighter colors for the highlights and cooler colors for the shadows. And I'll also show you how to create a family tree by using tape with this method. This was a requested tutorial. Mr. Darren Hendrickson teaches a 5th grade class that has been using my watercolor tutorials. A lot of their work was way better than the examples in my tutorials, so they did an awesome job. So I hope this is what you were looking for. The only colors we're using are blue, green, yellow, and orange. The technique we're going to be using for the sky, I think, makes this tutorial really easy. We're going to be painting light blue all over our paper, and then paint our tree and our landscape over the top of that light blue paint. This technique makes it a lot easier to have the sky and not worry about your colors bleeding into it or trying to paint the sky around those leaves and around those branches. These are the supplies that you need. You need watercolors. You need watercolor paper, watercolor paintbrushes, a pencil, water, a paper towel, and a scratch piece of paper to test out our colors, and masking tape. This will hold it down and it will also create a nice white frame around our painting. Let's get started. The first step is taping the borders with your masking tape. And you can have as thick or as thin borders as you would like. Then just go around the edges with your fingers to make sure it's sealed. And before we start painting, we are going to draw this tree together. When you draw on your watercolor paper, you want to draw really lightly, so lightly that you don't even need to erase any of your lines. And so you can just barely see them under your watercolor paints. I'm going to be drawing dark so that you can see my drawing, but remember you need to draw really lightly. Before we draw the tree, let's go ahead and draw in the shape of the hill or the valley that it is on. So let's draw the horizon line. We want this tree to be big and full, so I don't want to take up too much of my paper with the grassy area underneath. And then my tree is going to start below that horizon line, and it's going to be a little bit to the left. And then when you bring the trunk up into the sky, you want to just curve it in a little bit. And this is where that Y technique happens. This is how it happens, I guess. So this tree is going to branch off into a Y. So like if we fill these in, you can kind of see, let me get a little closer actually. So as you can see, it's making a Y. Let me just erase this line so you can tell this is in front of that hill. And now what you can do is create these other branches, and they are Ys as well. If you wanted to, you could branch this one up into a Y in that direction. You could bring a bigger one up out of this one, could go into a Y, or it might be covered by trees. And then you can bring some off the side as well. And then I'm also going to make this one into a Y. You can add more branches. There's a lot of ways to draw these trees, but the Y technique is the easiest way I've learned to start the tree and draw some of these branches in. You can also have branches going taller. This tree could be skinnier. I will erase my lines so that you can see these branches a little bit clearer. After we draw in these branches, we're going to draw in the top of our tree. Trees come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some trees are rectangular, some trees are more round and circular. So we're going to be using a technique where we draw circles in and then fill the circles in with our branches. When we're drawing the canopy of the tree, or where all of the leaves are in the top, we don't want to think of each little leaf. Instead, we want to look at it as a shape. What shape do all of those leaves make? And where is it light? Where is it dark? And some trees have more circular shapes in there, and that's the one that we are going to be drawing today. So we're going to be drawing 5 to 7 circles to indicate where those big shapes are in the top of our tree. And you kind of want to balance it. So let's start, and we're going to draw a large circle on this side, and maybe a bigger one on this side. Then a large one up here, and a smaller one over here. And then you can put this other shape, you could put it here, you could put it here. It totally depends on how you want to balance it out. I'm going to add it just up here, the smaller circle. Now that we have these shapes in, what we want to do is just kind of take the outside of it, and make it not quite so circular, and erase the lines that made your circles in the middle. Our leaves will overlap this line, so make sure you drew it really lightly. So I just traced my tree onto here lighter so that it's going to be a little bit easier for me to paint. After you sketch the tree, the first thing you want to do is paint the whole paper with a light blue. Make sure it's really light because we're going to be painting over the top of it. So we want it to be really muted, really light, and the way to do that is to create a large puddle of water in your tray. Use your flat brush for this part. When we paint in these larger areas, we're going to use our larger brush. So grab your flat brush and make a large puddle in your tray, large enough that you can cover the whole paper, and then grab your blue and drop it in. And that's what it looks like. So I want to mute it a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit of orange to it. I want it to be a little bit more neutral, and this is what it looks like now. You do not need to add the orange, but I just like the way that it looks a little bit better. And let's get started. I might add a little bit of water as I get towards the horizon line so that it gets a little bit lighter as I get towards the grass. So load up your brush and start painting. If you can tilt your paper forward so that your paint runs down it. There is a lot of ways to paint this. And let this layer dry, and I will show you the next step. Once your painting is dried, and to tell if it's dry, it should be flat, not shiny. My tree is a little bit shiny. Instead of working on the tree right now, let's move down to our grass. Make sure the blue paint underneath is completely dry, and we are just going to be painting some green over the top. All right, we already have this nice puddle here with blue in it. If you don't, just make another one. And I want my grass to be a little bit brighter, so I'm gonna add yellow to this blue. Make it kind of bright. You can make this as bright as you'd like, a little bit greener, it's just totally up to you. So this is the shade of that green. That's way too light. To make it darker, add more green to your puddle, more yellow. And I guess when I say darker, I don't really mean darker, I mean brighter, more saturated. We're not adding black to this. We're just trying to get a little bit more color. It's a little bit brighter now. I am going to add just a little bit of orange to it to neutralize it a little bit. I'll show you what that looks like. So instead of that, it just looks a little bit browner. I'm going to be using my flat brush on the bottom, and then I'm going to be using my round brush to create a feathering technique. So when I get to the top, I'm going to put some paint on my paintbrush, and then I'm going to feather out my paintbrush and paint the top of the grass, just to give it the effect of, I don't know, some texture on the top. And you don't have to do that. It's totally optional. So grab your green. We'll go ahead and start on the bottom and just start painting up. And try not to paint over that tree trunk. And then once we're at the top, we're gonna grab our smaller brush, dip it in our green, feather it out, and then just come along the top and add some texture. So I've just got green on my brush, and I'm just coming along the top with my brush fanned out and just creating some texture. And you could create some taller parts and some shorter parts. Sometimes artwork really has so much to do with those edges of things. All right, the top of my tree is dry, and now we're going to paint it in with green. This is the simple technique. So we are going to be using our paper towel to blot out our highlights. So in order to do that, we need to mix up a color for our tree. I would make it a different color from the grass, and I'm gonna make mine different just by adding blue to it. We're going to be painting it in with our round brush and really focusing on the edges. On the edges, we want it to look like there are leaves. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to start on the left side because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, you probably want to start on this right side. And let's start just from the top to bottom. So on the edges, I'm just lightly putting some texture out there. And you can leave some areas that are open inside if you want to. Make sure your puddle's big enough to fill in that whole space relatively quickly because we're trying to blot out our highlights, and you can't do that if it's dry. After you paint in with your green, you want to take your paper towel, kind of create like a round part by twisting it, and then figure out where you want your highlights to be, and you're just going to blot them out. So remember, we painted in those circles. You're kind of trying to find the circle shape. If you're going over the edges of your leaves like this, just make sure you're using a clean part of your paper towel. If you like, of course, you can add some more dark areas into the bottom of your tree. And back up in here, you just want to make sure it's still wet, or else those pieces that you're adding in can look a little bit strange. To paint in the trunk, just grab your green and orange. The more orange you add, the browner it will look. So let's see, that's pretty good. And then go ahead and paint in your trunk. And it's okay if your trunk bleeds up into those leaves. It'll just make the bottom of your canopy look a little bit darker. And at the bottom of the tree, I'm going to do the reverse of what I did before. I'm going to just bring the brown down into it using those feathers. And then we might want to give this tree a shadow. Since the sun's coming from the top, that's where we put our highlights with our paper towel. I'm going to just make it greener, not so brown. And you can add more blue to the shadow too. You can decide if you want your shadow to come straight down, if you kind of want it to go off at an angle. And then you can also use that darker color to just adjust this area under the tree. And also to add a shadow onto your tree. So we made the brown using green and orange. To make a darker shadow, we can add a little bit of blue to it, but I still want it to be brown. So make sure you add enough orange that your shadow is going to be brown. And then you can figure out where those shadows might be on your tree. You can add some texture to the bark, and you don't need to wait till it's completely dry to do this part. This would be the simple tree, where we just kind of used our paper towel to add those highlights, and we used a little bit of blue in the bottom, but we basically just used one color to paint in the canopy. So if this was the technique you used, you can go ahead and take your tape off. And there is our first example. One thing I want to point out really quickly is this tree does look a little bit unbalanced. As you can see, there is nothing over here. So you could come back in and add a little bit more to the side of the tree. It looks a little bit flat, and feel free to bring it right off of your paper. And in the second example, we are going to be using colors to create the light and the dark areas. So we're going to be using more of a yellow where it's light and more of a blue-green where it's dark. Also, in the second example, I'm going to use tape to mask out areas of squares so that you can create a family tree using this method. And in these boxes, you could put family names, you could put a symbol representing these people. If you want to have squares where you're going to be putting names or pictures that you're going to be drawing, I would just use tape. Then when you're painting your background, it's just a lot easier, and use scissors to just cut out the shape that you want for those different parts. And I would actually just put them all up in the tree. I did like how it looked when they were hanging from the branches too. That looked awesome. You can really do whatever you want. I'll show you some up in the tree and some hanging from one of the branches. So just cut squares of masking tape. For those of you who want to create a present for one of your parents or one of your grandparents, this is a great thing to do to create one of these family trees. If your paint is puddling up on your paper, you might need to spread it out a little bit more and maybe not even put as much on your paintbrush. After you paint in the blue background, you can go ahead and paint in the grass. Right after you paint in the grass, go ahead and paint in the tree. And I like to paint it just a little bit of a different color than my grass, so either bluer or more yellow. And in this tree, I'm just going to use 2 to 3 colors to create the shading. And I'm going to start with more of a yellow-green, which I'm going to mix up in my tray. So once you get that lighter color, you can go ahead and do the same thing we did in the first one, where we're just not dotting, but almost creating like dashes along these edges. And then on the inside, we can go ahead and just paint it in. It's okay to leave some areas that are unpainted. And I'm just going to be using this lighter color along the tops of the areas that I drew the circles on, and especially on the top of the tree. And I'm painting right over those pieces of tape. Then dip into your medium green and you can just go right back into those puddles and start moving down the tree. And as we move into the bottom of those circles that we created before, we're going to add some blue. So I'm going to add a lot of blue to this puddle now as I move down into the bottom of the tree. And you can bring the more blue-green up into the tree as well, but start at the bottom and then kind of think of where the bottom of those circles were. That's kind of where these dark areas should be. And you can also use the paper towel technique. You could go ahead and dab some spots up on top of the tree. And then we're going to do the same thing where we paint the tree trunk. So to make the tree trunk, I'm going to use the same puddle that I had before. Use orange with your green, and you can add blue if you want as well. If it looks too green, add more orange. If it looks too orange, add green. And then I like to start at the bottom of the trunk and then move up into the tree. And don't worry if it bleeds into the tree in some of these areas, that's okay. By the tree, you can create some texture on the trunk as well. So just think about where the sun is coming and where some of your shadows might be. Let's place a shadow underneath this tree. Add a lot of blue to your green puddle and then just go ahead and paint in the shadow from the tree. And it could go straight down, it could kind of go off to the side. Now let it dry. Once your paint is dried, you can take your pieces of tape off. Then you could use a pen or a marker to create frames inside of these. You could use a ruler to make it a little bit more consistent. And then you can go ahead and fill in these boxes with whatever family information. Or I think for Mr. Hendrickson's class, they put a symbol or an image that was representing that person. You could even just write their names inside of these boxes. So there are the 2 examples together. So in this one, we just used a paper towel to blot the highlights out. And in this one, we used different colors to create the light parts and the dark parts. And also you could put a background behind it. You could put a little landscape. There's that one. Don't feel like you can't add a little bit more behind it. And that's it. I hope that was helpful for you. Have a great day. We will see you around on YouTube. And again, Mr. Hendrickson, thank you so much for sending that email with the images of your class's artwork. Good luck with your projects. Mr. Hendrickson's class, I hope that you enjoy it and you have a lot of fun painting. Have a great day. We'll see you around on YouTube.